Hey, welcome to the Presence Church podcast. I'm your host, Mark Butler. Our team is part of a larger group that's planning a new church in South San Jose in the fall of 2025. We'd love for you to join us. To learn more, check out our website. That'll be down below in the description. Today, we're continuing in our series talking about redemption. This is the third episode in that series. Today, we're talking about the relationship between redemption and our families. I got to sit down with Pastors Chris and Suzy Parks once again. It was really cool to get to hear them share and just be authentic and vulnerable about their experiences with their families. I really hope that this conversation encourages you. Check it out.
Thank you, Jesus, for your love for all people. Thank you that you love deeply and that your desire is to create a family that is all yours, where you are the Father, you are the head, and you love each of us as your children. Pray that you would bless our conversation today in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, as you mentioned in your prayer, Chris, today we're talking about redemption and our families and how those two intermix. And I think, like a lot of these topics, we've probably hit on this here and there over the past 2 weeks in this series. But again, today we're going to try to focus on it specifically and frame our conversation around that as a single point rather than just touch on it in a larger conversation. So hopefully you guys are excited to get into that. I know we're talking about maybe we don't know. Are we talking super personally about our families? Should we text some people right now?
Well, we can always text them before it comes out.
That's right. Yeah, we have a whole month before this, when we're recording, until it will come out. I know, just the initial thought I had, I know this isn't the verse that we had referenced, but I know the concept, for some people, the concept of God's family and just Israel in general is kind of funky again in 21st century. There's not necessarily a people group that is elevated above another in America, right? That's actually something that most people would not be okay with, right? That's racist. That concept is very foreign, but it's the central theme of the entire Old Testament of the Bible is this
chosen
coming
one.
from a single family, a people group that is God's chosen people. So that was kind of my first initial thought, if we want to start there.
Yeah, I'd love to go upstream of what you just said.
Yeah.
Sorry, can we start the timer?
We need to start our timer.
So upstream of the nation of Israel is where God started with the family.
Yeah.
And that was in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. How'd that work out? Check out the last podcast. Yeah. Not awesome, right?
Shameless plug there.
Okay. So then Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden as part of the consequence of their sin. And you enter into this next period of time where they're having kids, and then there's the whole Cain and Abel thing, right? Cain kills Abel and does not end well. Yeah. And you move forward from there, and you get to the the order just left my brain. What comes next? The flood or the tower? The Tower of Babel comes next, or the flood? I feel bad. I can't remember. The brain is a little bit of mush.
I thought I'd had it, but then when you asked the question, I was I don't know.
Oh, let's go look. Talk amongst yourselves. Let me look at the beginning of Genesis.
I think it's the Tower of Babel and then the flood.
I think that's right.
In that answer, I don't know if it's right.
Do you want to phone a friend?
Yeah.
The flood occurred before the Tower of Babel.
Oh, we are all such good theologians.
Thank you, super producers.
Super producer Abby found the Googles.
Flood and then tower.
So
Noah.
Which is it's terrible. We needed Google for that, but
come to our church.
Yeah, we teach the Bible every week. That what we see in each of these instances is mankind. God is trying to build this family, this earthly family, and mankind keeps going their own way, not the way of God. And so, we
Sounds
talked,
familiar.
we talked a lot in the last podcast about who needs redemption, right? And why we need redemption. And it's because we keep going our own way. God has designed us for a relationship with him, but what makes that meaningful to God is that we have a choice. We get to choose God or not choose God. He wants people that are going to choose him. Mm-hmm. And so mankind keeps going their own way, and God keeps starting over with a new family, Mm-hmm. And you finally get to Abraham. And God speaks to Abraham in the desert and says, hey, start walking, and I'm going to tell you when to stop. And when you get to that place, I'm going to make you a great nation. And what he's saying is, I'm going to multiply your family, Abraham, in such a way that they become my people. And so God started like, hey, with all of humanity, let's do it this way. Oh, that didn't quite work. Okay, all right, let's start again with all of humanity. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, let's start again with all of humanity. And he goes through this cycle several times, and now he's like, let me start with a segment of humanity and see if we can make that work. And the failing it's not God's failing, it's humanity's failing along the way. And so he finally finds some level of success with Abraham, but really what happens is God pins himself to Abraham based on the promise he makes Abraham. Mm-hmm. And so in essence, God kind of backed himself into the proverbial corner, because he promised Abraham, if you'll follow me, if you have a relationship with me, here's all the things that will happen as a result. And so Abraham follows God, does his best, and God is one who always keeps his promises. And so even though the nation of Israel throughout all of its history from that point to today has really struggled to stick with God along the way, God has been faithful to them, and that's how you get a people that are the chosen people of God. But when Jesus and in the Old Testament, there were ways for people who were not Jews to become Jews, right? So if you were born in another nation, you could become a Jew. And in the same way, in the New Testament, as Jesus fulfills all these promises, Jesus certainly makes a way for those of us that were not born Jews to be part of God's family, which we see all over the New Testament, right? There's neither Greek or Jew. There's no nationality. We're just followers of Jesus in one family. So there's a little bit of this sense of exclusivity in the Old Testament. But it's more perceived than reality.
Yeah, the concept of redemption gets a lot of mileage in the family of Israel.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like that's like every time I go back to the Old Testament, like because the nation of Israel, right? Like that's always what people talk about. The city of Jerusalem, right? Like all these things, you don't think someone's family for the most part. Like that's not what comes to my mind first when you say the word Israel. It's not like, oh, you're talking about someone's
Abraham's
family.
kids.
Yeah, I instantly go to the nation, hundreds, thousands of people. But if you read through the Old Testament, it starts with a single person, right? Like just Abraham, and it's a very gradual increase into a full nation. And the first many chapters after God makes that covenant is with like 3 people, right? Like 10 people, 15, and it is a very clearly just a family like yours, right? In this room, it's 2 generations, 3 generations, very manageable for us to think about in the context of what I would call a family today.
But what you see in family redemption, there's always one generation that is the turning point. So if you start with Adam and Eve and count down the generations, right, to the flood, then, so forth. You go from the flood and the survivors of the flood, Noah's family coming off the boat, and you see the lineage, I believe through Shem, is where you get to Abraham. And so Noah said, I'm going to follow God, even though everybody thinks I'm a lunatic, because he lived, before the flood, it had never rained. Right? I mean, it had never rained, and he lived hundreds of miles from the nearest body of water, best we can tell. So he makes this decision to follow God in spite of the wackiness of the appearance. Abraham, living his best life, we have no indication that he had any kind of relationship with God until God spoke to him. And then
he wasn't an Israelite because it didn't
Right.
exist
They
at
didn't
that
exist.
point. He was
Yeah.
just a guy in a country.
Right.
somewhere. Yeah.
right.
Random dude.
And so he says yes to following God, right? He made a decision to leave all of everything he knew, his family and everything, and just start walking. It wasn't like God said, hey, walk from, here to there, go to this town, and that I'm going to make your own. There was zero certainty in it for Abraham. God literally said, start walking, and I'll show you the land when you get there, right? And so here's this great big step of faith where he said, hey, I don't know how the rest of this stuff is going to work out, but I'm sticking with God.
Yeah, that's good. And I mean, we could probably pull that apart a little bit now and talk about how that applies to like families today. When you said it takes one generation to say, like, I'm turning, and me and my kids and their kids and their kids are going to be different because of a decision that I want to make.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know,
was us.
Suzy, you have I'm sure you have a lot of experience with that in just generally, like not talking about specifics, but in inner healing. We talked last week, right, about generational curses and some specific things that are broken off.
Yeah.
Can you touch a little bit more on kind of the dynamic with those like generational decisions to turn from one way to another?
Yeah, absolutely. For, you see a lot in inner healing, but, even for me personally, my parents loved me very much. They loved my brother very much. They're no longer here. But even if they were here, I would still tell their story because they would be okay with that. But I'm a child of divorce, and my mom was married 4 times. My dad was married 3 times. And I knew that I wanted to be married and have children, and I wanted to break that generational path, direction, curse of divorce that was really in relationships throughout my lineage. I can think all the way back to my grandmother on my dad's side. My great grandfather was married to my great grandmother for till she passed away, and then he remarried. But starting with my grandmother on my dad's side, and then all through beyond my great grandmother on my mom's side, this cycle of divorce and just relationships. And usually all of the women in the family, they knew Jesus and they served Jesus, and the men did not. And so for me, when I was thinking about marriage and thinking about the spouse that I wanted someone who loved Jesus. And that is something that was really important to me. And I don't even think, being that young, I could fully comprehend what that would mean for the trajectory of our children. But I just knew that's where I drew the line. Like, all these other things didn't matter to me. And so I think when we look at patterns in our ancestry, we can see patterns of infidelity, patterns of addictions, and they can play out differently. So
Was
like
there something that triggered you to look into that? Because like I haven't looked at my lineage back to my great grandparents and looked specifically at like divorce or infertility, right? Some of these things.
but
like,
your
was
parents
there-
are married.
They are. But like, was there something that triggered you to look back
Divorce.
that far? It was. Okay.
Divorce.
And you're
yeah.
like, oh, is this a pattern?
Yeah,
Or-
being a child of divorce, it makes you ponder some things.
Yeah. But it didn't just come up naturally. You sought it out
Yeah.
back that far.
Yeah, because I wanted to see the correlations. Like, was it
A one-off
was it
or-
one off, right? Because my mom you know, we always say like my mom did the best that she could do at the time, and she did better than her mom, and she did better, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so you look at the lineage, and I had alcoholism in my family, drug addiction in my family. I had infidelity was rampant in my family. And so when you look at all of these factors, you start to see patterns. And it was both on my mom's side and my dad's side. And in order to change a pattern, you have to start seeing what are the developing patterns. And it was addictions had their lives. And it was, you know, whether it was a sexual addiction, an alcoholic addiction, a work addiction. So one generation would trade an addiction for a different addiction, but it was still an addiction that their lives were centered around.
Yeah.
And so that was really impactful for me, even in decisions later on in our lives where, you know, my mom wanted us to take over her restaurant. And because knowing that I have that in me, I have this addictive personality tendency that I would be all consuming with work. And so I have to battle against that because it is something that is in my lineage.
Yeah.
It is something that was passed down generation to generation to generation. And so some things that are passed down generation to generation, something we tell our kids, we have alcoholism in our family history.
On both sides.
On both sides. And so when you have something like that, you tell your kids, the Bible doesn't say thou shalt not drink. It says thou shalt not be drunk. But if you can't have one drink without being tempted to be drunk, then you should not drink. And so all those different factors in our history kind of helped inform how we wanted to change the trajectory of our children's lives for generations. We wanted to be the first generation. For me, college was at like a low priority for me, even though my family hadn't been to college. For me, it was more important that if we were going to change a generation, it was going to be a generation based on Jesus and the family, not on college. I didn't care about that. That wasn't what I was passionate about. I wanted the generation of change to be for Jesus and for the family.
Yeah.
And that was
really, really valuable, like, awareness. And I think that's something, again, being a little bit newer for me, is to even ask those questions. Because I think some of the things you mention, maybe this is just me, but I think some of the things you mention are maybe what people would call obvious, like generation, like alcoholism. I think if you asked most people off the street, like, is that something that you think you would get from your parents? Like, I think most people would say yes. A couple of the other addictions you mentioned are like psychologically, like, addictions are easy to pass down. I think some of the other things you mentioned are more subtle, just as destructive, but looking at backwards and finding patterns for me has been a new and very valuable, like as you've discovered and other people have, awareness of those tendencies, so that you can speak against those, speak truth against those, make those commitments together as a married couple, or even for yourself individually. And I think I've in the past have only known or heard people talk about the obvious, like alcohol or drug addictions, and not as much about things that are more subtle, or like infertility, that's like not talked about at all. So it's very difficult unless you really dig into it and ask your parents or your grandparents questions of like those that you just don't know, and can have a big impact on how you should be, what you should be paying attention to, or focusing on.
And I think at least for us, I think I know I'll speak for myself and my family. He can speak for his, but it's easier for me because my parents are no longer here, but their siblings and we still have generations here, but we've also had a lot of generations that have passed away. But I will say that some of the things are very, even alcohol and drug addiction are more subtle than you would think. Like even growing up, all of this was happening around me and I had no idea because I was sheltered
Yeah.
from my mom and my dad. Like I had no idea until later on in life where I was just honestly surprised and shocked that at how much depth there was there. And like when you think of infertility and infidelity, those two specifically, I mean, for generations, you just didn't talk about sex in any form. So whether it was infidelity
Right.
or infertility,
Yeah.
you didn't talk about it because it was shameful either way you go. Like if you can't have a child, then something's wrong with you. You caused it, or, you know, you've done something, or infertility, for obvious reasons. But nonetheless, it's not talked about.
Yeah.
And so diving deep, but secrets for my family came out with, you know, children being born, you know, and having this repeated generational cycle, not once, not twice, 3 times, and for 4 generations of kids being born that were not from their mom and dad.
Yeah.
You know, and so in a marriage relationship. And so I think, yeah, it just makes for me want to know, like, who am I? Where do I come from? And why do I have the tendencies that I do or the temptations that I do? Where does that come from?
Yeah.
And I mean, pain is really the driver of addiction. Addictions, I mean, not a psychologist, right? So whatever, take this for what it's worth. But in my mind, addictions primarily exist to cover or act as a coping mechanism to deal with pain, right? So I think what has been a real gift to us has been the realization that we can work through the thing that's causing the pain and relieve it in a healthier way, as opposed to leaning into addictions to mask the pain that we feel. And I'd like to say that we were better at this than we actually were. I'd like to say that we figured this out on our own. I mean, I'd like to pretend like we don't have any problems now because we put in 25 years of hard work. None of those things are true. But there is something very real about engaging in the difficult process of finding healing for yourselves. And we've talked a little bit in recent episodes about inner healing work, prayer healing work that we've done to try to bring to the surface some of these things that are very painful from our past. And it's really just been, I think, a gift from God where he's pointed us toward the pain and helped us realize that leaning into it is the pathway to healing rather than trying to cover it up. And so that's been sort of a bellwether for us in terms of how to identify what to work on. It's been where do we feel the most pain in our relationship and in our lives, and how do we kind of lean into that and find healing?
Yeah, because when I think of, you know, the pain of, you know, divorce and the pain of, you know, as every parent, no one gets married to, you know,
Planning to get divorced.
no, you know, and when you do, you go through inner healing and you do these things, something that comes up a lot is this idea of abandonment, this fear of abandonment. And it stems somewhere, usually from this place where someone in their life left them.
Yeah.
Right? Somewhere along the lines, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a divorce. It could be even sibling to sibling, right? So an older sibling like myself, I left when I was 18. I graduated and I still had a younger sister at home. She was 5. So when I leave and she's there, then she has these feelings of abandonment. And so there's just, it's not
It's not even always something that was done to you in an evil sort of a way. It's
Correct.
just sometimes how life goes.
Sometimes it's just, part of growing up and all of the things. And so we have these things that we don't even necessarily know that we need healing from, that we need, to kind of break this cycle. And sometimes it's an unhealthy cycle that we're breaking. And sometimes it's a cycle that maybe it's not unhealthy, but it's not the cycle or the path that is what I need to be going on in my generation.
Yeah, that's so good. And thank you both for sharing. I know we left a little bit of like Israel and the Bible, but or actually, let me take a half step back, because I know we were talking about for our families. I don't know if we got all the way to the redemption piece. We talked a lot about like being aware and leaning into the pain, which is probably only the first half-ish, probably. And we didn't quite get all the way to the positive, right? The hope that we have, which is that we don't have to be stuck, right? It's very important to be aware and to learn of the past and our present pain and what tendencies we might have, but we don't stop there, right? Like that's the important piece, is that we make sure that we don't stay there, that we then take the next step, which you did mention it, you touched on it, of like inviting Jesus into that pain, whether it was done to you from family, or I know especially, right, for like generational things, like you might not feel like physically, like I wasn't in the room when that thing happened, so like emotionally,
how does it affect me?
I don't connect to it super directly, but maybe I'm experiencing something in my life that was a trickle down side effect of that. So how do we get from the place of recognizing and being aware, and how do we get to that like redemptive, like redeemed place?
I think for me, when we're followers of Jesus, we can see how our family needs redemption, right? And we can see, like, for those that are obvious, that are hurting, those that feel hopeless, those that don't really understand the depth of Jesus's love and hope that is in that to bring them out of that. And then there's those that, the Bible tells us are prodigals, that, have turned away from him, that they know the truth, but they're choosing another path. What we talked about before, like we're choosing to not follow him. He lets us have a choice in that. And so sometimes it looks like people seeking God and the redemptive story. And sometimes it looks like us crying out to God to bring our family into reconciliation with him so that they can be redeemed. And, because for me, some of my family has went through a lot of different really hard things. I've had family member who was, in prison, and, he literally was told that he is unredeemable, that the things that he's done, we talked about this in an earlier episode of Jesus died for the murderer just as he did, for you and I. Now, he didn't murder anyone, but at the end of the day, even if he had, then God says, I still choose you. But when you have a pastor or someone tell you that you're unredeemable, getting to that redemption is really, really difficult. And so we have a responsibility to help people understand the lengths and that God will go to redeem you. But it's still your choice. And the depth of his love for you to go after and pursue you.
I mean, in my story, similar in that my parents are divorced, I was 10 when they divorced. And, in the same way that Susie's parents did the very best that they could, my parents did the very best that they could. And they dealt with a lot in life. And, that sort of set me on a particular path that required me to do the work of healing. And, how you go from, the status quo in life, right? Whatever I've accepted as stasis in my life, however broken and painful that is. How do I go from that to this rich and satisfying life that Jesus talks about? There's a lot of steps from one thing to the end goal. And, for me, that had to do with a lot of like father wounds and things that I really had to work through. And both my parents are still alive. And to be honest, it took a lot of hard conversations with my dad and I. And I can look back at multiple points in time where we engaged in those hard conversations, him and I. And it really helped to bring a lot of healing and a lot of understanding, and just asking questions like, Dad, why did this go that way? Or why did you do this? Or why did you not do that? And getting to hear from him, his perspective on things was very healing for me, very helpful for me to understand. It helped me to understand his past and why he made some of the choices that he made. And I've had similar conversations
Even have empathy.
Yeah, to have empathy, for him and the way that he faced things in his life. And it's like, oh man, yeah, if I had to deal with that, I don't know how I would respond to that. So, just gaining a better perspective on the person that I'm struggling to have a better relationship with and to find some healing was a very helpful step in the journey for me. And then honestly recognizing that, I have my parts to own in us having a strained relationship over the years. And so just being willing to say to him, hey, I'm sorry that I didn't call more often, or that I didn't attempt to engage more. And every situation is going to be a little bit different. I would just say, in terms of seeking the redemption of your family, it's twofold. It's like, Noah, when he had to decide, am I going to follow the voice of God? Am I going to follow God's call for my life? Am I going to have a relationship with God, and I'm going to build this boat in the middle of a desert? Or am I going to do something different? He had to make a clear decision, and that decision impacted generations to come. Like for us, we make decisions. It's going to impact our kids and their spouses. Sorry. Noah made a decision that impacted the entire world.
Yeah.
So, we're in, now, I had just turned 20. She was 19 when we met. And, we met
2 years ago.
Yeah, it was a little while ago.
Young kids.
There was about a month from the day we first met. There was about a month before we saw each other again. I think you had some travel or something, family vacations, whatever. Yeah. And when she came home, we saw each other, I think, for the first time we saw each other since the first time we met. So it was the second time we saw each other. That afternoon, we went to lunch with a small group of people. That night, we went on our first date. And that night, we began this process of generational redemption, because it was in that very first deep conversation we had that we shared some of these, like deep sourced wounds that we had. And just bringing those things to the light, we talked about that in our last podcast, I think it was, or recently, where we talked about how bringing our sin to the light robs it of its power. Yeah. And the same is true for wounding. Sometimes our own sins are what cause the wounding. Sometimes it's others that cause the wounding in our life. But the principle is the same for both. When we bring our wounds to the light, they begin to heal. They lose the power to control us when we bring them to the light. And so just beginning that process together, having a partner in life that we can very imperfectly, work through those things together. But the thing that we did in the beginning of our marriage was agree that we were going to be a changed generation, and whatever it took, we were going to do it. We were going to pay the price to have a healthy marriage. And we knew we would not do it well all the time. We knew that we would do it with a lot of brokenness. There'd have to be a lot of grace for one another. But that we were going to give that grace so that we could build the relationship that we believe God wanted us to have, the marriage that God intended for people to enjoy. And again, it's not a statement of judgment on anybody else around us who have divorced or anything like that. It was just that for us, God put two people together who had experienced divorce and were determined to not experience it firsthand in our marriage. And God's been very good to us, very gracious. We've shared stories of, even on this podcast, we shared a story recently about yelling at each other in a hotel room,
Yeah.
and
And our kids know when we're not happy with one another.
Oh.
Like they know. Our kids, significant others know as well. when
that right, Zabe?
they are super producers, they know. I don't have a poker face, so everybody knows. But I think that that's part of the healthy thing. For me, I watched growing up, pushing things under the rug and hiding things, and I think for us, learning how to communicate and learning how to have conflict and resolve conflict, but to let our kids know that we do have conflict. Like we don't,
and it's okay.
and it's okay.
It's okay that
it's
there's
healthy
conflict.
to have conflict, and we don't, like, they're all dating, and not all of them, but our two are dating, and then our son is married, and for them to be in relationships and understand there will be conflict, and how you work through that conflict is really important. But if they had never seen us have conflict, then they'll go, oh, there must be something wrong with me.
Yeah, that is one of the greatest mistakes that parents make, is they don't fight in front of their kids. And I'm not suggesting that every fight is appropriate in front of your kids, but it is important for them to recognize that it's okay to be unhappy with each other. It's okay to be frustrated. But what they need to see is how parents work through it in a healthy way. And so that's I think one of the best things that we've been able to do. And we'll have to have our kids on at some point. We can ask them if they agree. But I think one of the best things that we've been able to do is to just be real in front of our kids.
Yeah.
And, we tried to shield them from the really dark stuff, the really difficult stuff. But the medium to lighter things, we really wanted them to experience what it looked like for us to have a disagreement and work through it.
But as they get older, I think it's healthy because, we talked about infertility and, although we didn't struggle with that, but something that is not talked about is postpartum depression. And then, I'm in this season of hormones where perimenopause has now entered the realm, and it's a lot like postpartum depression. And we have history on both sides of, different people in our lives that have had depression, but we don't talk about it. And so I think that's part of being redeemed by Jesus, is putting all of it out there.
Yeah.
So that he can redeem
and it's
all of it.
redefining it too, right? That's
Yeah.
part of what redemption is in not just marriage, but
Right.
also in other areas of life. Is it's redefining the truth of that thing,
Right.
and that includes the vulnerable and authentic pieces of those areas of life. Is to redefine them the way that Jesus does.
Yeah.
And it isn't perfect, right? Because we're both humans in a marriage, right? But you're doing your best to redefine what marriage is in the context of like how Jesus would define it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and different people respond to these generational things different ways. So I have a good friend who his family, he and his brother, they grew up just very poor. Their parents struggled all the way through their lives, and they just really didn't have much money. They never lacked for anything. They always had a meal. They always had a roof. They always had clothes. They always had the things they needed, but they had nothing extra. And my friend responded by saving every penny that he made. He went to college. He got a great job, and he saved. His brother went the opposite direction and just spent everything and enjoyed every penny that he had because he never had anything as a kid to enjoy. So he got a good job and spent all of his money enjoying things. And, there's the parable of the prodigal son in Luke. And, the idea is as, a wealthy family, and the youngest son comes to the father and says, hey, I want all my inheritance now, and I'm out, right? And so the father gives him what he wants, and off he goes, and he wastes all of it. And a famine hits, and he's not prepared, and he ends up living literally in a pig pen, right, in this parable. And he decides, well, even my father's servants at home, his employees, eat better than I do. I'm just going to go back home and see if my dad will give me a job. I won't be a son. I'll be a hired hand. And he goes home, and the way Jesus tells the parable, this father is looking. He sees the son from afar off coming, which tells us that father was looking for his son to come home. And of course, the one of the principles here is that our Heavenly Father is looking for us to come home in a relationship with Him, to be redeemed from our brokenness and our sin and our wounds, and come home to Him. And so that Father receives his son back. He puts the robe on him and puts the ring and welcomes him back into the family, and he kills the best calf that they have, and he throws a party. But there's another side to this story where the older brother is out in the field working, and he comes back, and he says, he's pissed, right? Just say,
rightfully so.
Just say it the way it is. He's pissed because he's like, Dad, I've been here. I've been faithful. I've done everything you've ever wanted me to do, but you've never once given me the resources, like to have the best animal, to have this great feast with my friends. Like I've done everything you've ever asked of me, but you've never done this for me. And the principle at work here is we can sin in two different ways. We can respond to life's situation in two different ways. So one was a very dutiful son, but his identity was not in his relationship with his father. His identity was in his service. It was in his performance.
Doing the right thing.
It was in doing the right thing. And the other son responded to this by saying, heck with this, I'm out of here. He just rejected the whole thing. Both of them came back to the father and had to have this moment of healing, right, in reconciling with the Father. And so we can respond to life's wounds and hurts, life's situations in different ways. And even coming from the same circumstances, two different people could have two completely different responses, but both often require healing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way to land the plane for our time today. So thank you both for sharing your experiences with your families and being vulnerable. I know last week we talked about leading with vulnerability and authenticity. So thank you both for leading in that way today and sharing your stories and your family's stories. And I hope that brings anyone listening a lot of grace and hope for their situation as well.
Yeah. There's a lot of hope. There is hope. Jesus will redeem every situation in your life. Every relationship can be redeemed. So hang in there. Stick with it.
Yeah. And that hope ultimately comes from the truth, which is that one moment in His presence
changes everything.